Welcome, everyone, to the Torrey Botanical Society's Torrey Talks. I am Catherine. I'm your programming chair. I want to talk a little bit about the society before we get started. So the Torrey Botanical Society was founded in 1867, and we're an organization for anyone interested in plant life, from professional and amateur botanists to students and people who simply enjoy being in nature. The aim of the society is to collect and disseminate information on all phases of plant science. And in order to do that, we have public lectures like this. We also have field trips. Oh, how do I change the slide? Here we go. We also have field trips. So upcoming, we have a sort of field trip related to this lecture on the 27th at NYBG. Stay tuned on the website and in your email for more information on that. We also published the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society. I wanted to highlight here some recent papers in the journal. So we had one advanced access paper that just came out today, hot off the presses, about lichens in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. And there's also a few early access papers here on New York State. So if you're a New Yorker, check those out for sure. Oh, that is not how I change slides. Here we go. Oh, and then upcoming, we also have the annual banquet. Next month is going to be here. Ryan Schmidt from Harvard University is going to be talking about the hidden heroes of herbaria, and we will also have a banquet after the talk. We also, to stay tuned on everything that the Torrey Society does, consider becoming a member. It is really helpful for us to continue to do all of the things that we are doing. And you can learn more about that at torreybotanical.org or on all of our social medias. We're at Torrey Botanical on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and on YouTube, where we put recordings of all the lectures. We're at Torrey Botanical Society. Okay, a few notes before we get started. We'll have the lecture and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. Feel free, if you're on Zoom, put your thoughts in the chat, put your questions in the chat. We will come back to them at the end of the talk. If you're interested in asking a question at the end of the talk, just raise your hand. But during the talk, please keep yourself muted. And that, I think, is all I have to say about Zoom notes. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, John Zeiger, who is the manager of the Thain Family Forest at New York Botanical Garden. John earned his master's from SUNY ESF, and before joining New York Botanical Garden was the preserve manager for Westchester Land Trust, where he maintained trails, boundary markers, and preserve infrastructure, and also mitigated ecological threats to the preserve, such as deer browse and invasive species. Since 2024, he's been at NYBG, where he manages a 50-acre old-growth forest, manages on-site research, and also supports regional conservation. And with that, I will hand it over to John to talk about reintroducing extirpated flora at NYBG.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm John. I'm the manager of the Thain Family Forest at the New York Botanical Garden, and I'll give you a little bit about my background before I start. So, as Catherine said, I worked for 4 years as the preserve manager for Westchester Land Trust. I managed a 1,000-acre preserve system that crossed Westchester and Putnam County boundaries. And now I manage the 50-acre old-growth forest at the heart of the New York Botanical Garden. Can you actually turn your slides so if I could see them, yeah. And I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the project Reintroducing Extirpated Flora to the Thain Family Forest. Basically, during this presentation, I'm going to start with an introduction to what the Thain Family Forest is. Then I'm going to talk about the Extirpated Flora project. I'm going to break it down into 5 steps. The steps are a soil sampling project to understand the soil, a comprehensive evaluation of our extirpated species. We have an entire list that's publicly available of species that we recognize as extirpated in the Thain Family Forest. Our method of trial plots, of trying to evaluate which species could potentially be candidates for a larger reintroduction, designing a large-scale project, and evaluation and assessment of that project, and also the future vision of where this could go if it's successful or if we experience challenges, and where this project would go down the line. I also just want to be upfront about we're very early on in this project. As we go through these slides, this is a project that is very much ongoing, and I think there's a lot of people probably paying attention to this right now who might know things about some of these flora on our extirpated list that I don't know, and we welcome feedback. So if you have ideas or thoughts at the end of this talk, I welcome any feedback on this topic. So to start, I'm going to give an overview of the Thain Family Forest itself. So this is a 50-acre forest. It's the largest old-growth forest in New York City. There is other old growth patches, but there's something impressive about a large remnant tract of forest in one of the densest cities in the country. And we have a pretty good team of a small but a pretty good team of people that manage this forest. We have me, and then we have 2 horticulturalists. I think combined we actually have almost 50 years of horticultural experience. And the horticulturalists I work with specialize in natural areas management. And about 60% of the time that we spent taking care of this forest is involved with invasive species management. The other 40% is mostly related to trail maintenance, professional development, ecological monitoring, and projects like this, the reintroduction of extirpated species. I also just want to add that even though a lot of our focus is on stewardship and taking care of the ecological integrity of the forest, we really value research, education, and visitor engagement in the forest as well. And a few more things I want to talk about just to give a background and context of the forest. This is an old growth forest. That doesn't mean that there's no human impact. There's actually been an extensive human impact on this land for a very long time. Going back thousands of years, the Thain Family Forest, like a lot of this region, was under Lenape stewardship. We don't know if they used fire on the landscape, but in many areas that was a tool that people used to steward the landscape, and that definitely affected the flora on the landscape. We have found archaeological evidence that people hunted, and people, at least for short periods of time, spent time around the forest. People probably used the Bronx River corridor. The Bronx River runs right through the Thain Family Forest. They probably used that as a travel corridor, and they probably gathered and hunted and fished in the area. After the Lenape period, we had the Lorillard estate, which was a colonial kind of or past colonial estate that owned a lot of the land in that area of what is now the Bronx. And my office, actually, the stone mill, is in the old tobacco mill that the Lorillards had, and they probably had an impact on the forest during that time. They probably selectively cut trees. They probably, they impacted the forest in other ways. That might not be visible today, but they never cut it. They never farmed it, and there's not a lot of evidence that it was ever pastured as well. After the Lorillard estate, the land came into New York City parkland, even before the Bronx was a part of New York City. And then eventually it made its way into NYBG. Actually, I've been told that the reason why NYBG is in the place where it is because of the beauty of that forest and the gorge that runs through it. So originally, when this came into NYBG stewardship, there was a hands-off policy. It's a natural area. It can manage itself. Since that time, we've really realized that in urban areas, there's so many human impacts on the land, from invasive species to invasive disease to climate change to pollution and habitat degradation, that if we don't take an active hand in managing those areas, we're going to lose a lot of biological integrity. We're going to lose a lot of biodiversity. So We manage these areas for biological health by pushing back, by removing those invasive species, by thinking about ways that we might mitigate climate change, and the forest can adapt to climate change, to understand the effects pollution has on the forest, and to think about ways that even if, if any of you have heard of the idea of island biogeography, small populations that are restricted and can't disperse can often go extinct just by random means. So thinking about maybe, if we have an island that, our forest kind of is an island, can we maybe bring species from other islands and create that dispersal? So we have an adaptive management framework at the Thain Family Forest, and what that basically means is that we continuously evaluate our work based on data, and then we change course as necessary. We're not just set into a course and we're just going to keep plowing forward no matter what. We do this through our continuous forest inventory. So every 5 years, we do a series of belt transects, 250 total, that cover 15% of the whole forest area. And that gives us the information on the woody vegetation and the herbaceous vegetation of the forest. And what we've seen is that our management is working. We've got strong declines in woody invasive species. We have herbaceous upland species at fairly low levels. And our biggest challenge right now is vines and some of our floodplain invasives. Like you see right now, people are cutting Japanese knotweed, which is a big problem in the Bronx River floodplains. We also have smaller pilot projects that are meant to study different techniques that, maybe we could do smaller pivots. For example, could we be seeding wildflowers instead of planting, or could we be direct seeding acorns instead of planting seedlings? Also, trialing plants that might be able to compete in the floodplain, which has more invasive species than any other part of the forest that we manage. Lastly, the forest is a really important research site. We have a lot of external research that occurs in the forest, and we often see this as opportunities to inform our stewardship. Because so much data is being collected there, that we can pull from that data and learn from it. And we have about 15 ongoing external research projects right now from CUNY, from Binghamton, New York City Bird Alliance, Wildlife Conservation Society, Columbia, USGS, EPA, and the breadth of projects is actually pretty crazy. We have everything from ants to salamanders to urban heat island effect to studying isoprene production, which is a biological volatile organic compound that comes from leaves, to studies in the water quality in the Bronx River, and studies on how the forest might change due to beech leaf disease, which is a disease that could devastate one of our most common trees in the forest. So now I'm going to focus on that key project, the Reintroducing Extirpated Species. So for this project, a lot of work was done before I arrived. This is a project that the institution is very interested in, and they've already done a lot of the groundwork. They started with the historical record. So to reintroduce extirpated species, we first had to know what the extirpated species are. So that involved looking at a lot of herbarium specimens and older records. And Daniel Atha in 2016 created a comprehensive list of the garden flora and of the species that have been recorded at the garden in the past. Some of it's a little iffy. If you know anything about how the garden was arranged in the past, there's sections of the garden that used to be part of the garden but now aren't. There's references to things like Bronx Park, which actually could be several different parts of the Bronx. But we did the best we could, and we came up with a list that we think was the original flora 100 years ago of the New York Botanical Garden. And then we compared that to the flora that we're seeing today. And we have a list of about more than 100 species that have been documented and herbarium vouchered at the garden that are no longer present. And that list is public. If you look at the Thain Family Forest Management Program, which is a public document, and I can share with anyone, you can see it. It's on page 75. And our goal is to incorporate those extirpated species back into the spontaneous flora where possible. So that means that we're not just like planting them and doing a little restoration planting and that's it. We really want to create a project where they become, with minimal intervention, a part of the naturally reproducing flora of the forest. And we want to go, this is kind of taking our restoration work to the next level. Until now, a lot of what we've done has been just protecting what we had and removing invasive species and trying to fight for the species that were here already and that we've managed to retain. This is trying to enhance that biodiversity and bring back species that have been lost. So what are the steps to do this? The way I see this project, it's broken into 5 main steps. This first step is a soil survey. Soil is incredibly important to understanding the capacity of plants to grow in a landscape. So to really understand if we could bring plants back, we want to understand the conditions of the soil. Step 2 is that list of like 113 species. We wanted to go through every single species and evaluate it based on a series of variables and see if they're still appropriate for the site. Step 3 is sourcing local seed or plants for small-scale trial plots. By the way, step 3 is where we are right now, just to give context. So basically, once you've established some species that could be good candidates, testing them in the field. Step 4, which we're not at yet, and we probably won't be for quite some time, is once we've evaluated those pilot projects, those pilot trial plots, we want to design a large-scale reintroduction project for at least a few of these species that encompasses the larger forested landscape. And then step 5, under that adaptive management framework, whenever you're doing work, you want to then be assessing your work at every step and seeing if you're going the right direction. And I don't really include this as a step because it informs all of the steps, but it's really important to review the scientific literature and get feedback from experts. That's part of what I'm trying to do right now. So I'd say the first step is the soil sampling. And this we completed in 2014 or 2024. So the map that you see here, every single red square is one of our 20 soil sampling locations. If you look at the top left of the map, you see a square where you have smaller squares in white. And on the top, you see 3 Bs. Then in the middle, you see 3 As. And at the bottom, you see 3 Bs. Those are our 9 subsampling points. So at each of those red squares, we had 9 subsampling points. And then we found a methodology that allowed us to capture a few different things at once. We wanted to, I've already talked about the continuous forest inventory, those plots that we use for our evaluation of our work. You can actually see that on this map. They're those smaller dots that go across the forest from east to west. You can see that we've actually aligned those soil sampling plots with as many of the continuous forest inventory plots as we could. The goal was to have layers. So we had a layer of vegetation data, and then we could layer soils data on that as well. You can also see there's a grid on that map. The grid was a breakdown that allowed us to follow a Smithsonian forest geo methodology, which is a global standardized methodology for soil sampling. And we wanted this data to be comparable with other soil sampling data being done around the country and around the world. And I won't dive too much into the details, but basically we aggregated some of our soil data. Some of the data wasn't aggregated to understand the kind of more differences, across the subsampling locations. And then we looked into a few different things, including litter depth, earthworm presence, organic horizon depth, and we took soil from depths of 0 to 10, 10 to 20, and 30 to 50 centimeters. We also, so once all the data was collected, it is or will be assessed for pH, heavy metals, soil micronutrients, organic matter, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, carbon, and nitrogen. And the things that were most interesting to me were the heavy metals and the pH, because past soil sampling showed that we had very heavy amounts of very high amounts of heavy metals in the soil, as well as very acidic soil, which can be important for plant growth. And I want to give credit to Brad Oberle, who largely led this project. I was a co-PI, but he was the main PI, and he's actually presented on this work, I believe, for the Torrey Botanical Society. He was very interested in those legacy heavy metals and if they're still in the soil, and if not, where did they go? He was also really interested in how old growth urban soils store carbon. The reason this was such a great project is we were both really interested in soils, but coming from completely different angles, and we were able to design a project that accomplished both of our goals. My main goal was to understand the spatial distribution of things like pH and organic matter and heavy metal in the soil across the forest, so I could understand which species would be better candidates for the soil as they are today, and also if species could potentially do well in some soils and not others, where would be the best places to plant them. And this work was done by a team of interns. It was a joint team of horticulture and science interns, which was a lot of fun. And we actually just received our heavy metal and pH data in March. So I'm about to start analyzing that soon. And basically, once we have this data, we're going to map it across the forest and try to understand how that affects our plants. So the second step is investigating those extirpated plants. So we have that long list of species, and every single species, I'm going to give my interns a lot of credit last summer. They created a massive spreadsheet, and they assessed them against around 20 different variables. To kind of summarize them a little bit, I've listed the main categories here. One, are these species already spreading at the garden? So there are a few species on the extirpated list that I noticed were already moving, like naturally moving out of planted areas as almost weedy plants around the garden. So that was something I noted. If it obviously is a plant that wants to be here. Are there regional prevalence of these species? So we used iNaturalist for this. iNaturalist data is great if you're not familiar with it. And we looked at whether they were prevalent in natural areas of Bronx parks, in New York City parks, and in regional parks. Are they climate resilient? Are these species climate resilient? So we looked at maps of regional distribution and species. We basically made the assumption that if species were present in lowland North Carolina, not in the mountains, but in the lowlands or further south, they would probably be okay with the near future climate predictions. It was a fairly brute force climate resiliency model. And I think there's a lot of people that are thinking a lot about climate resiliency, and we would love to have opportunities to incorporate more sophisticated models in the future, but it's good enough for now. And we looked at pollinators and dispersal agents. So we looked at if a plant could do well here, but if it didn't have any way to get pollinated or for its seeds to disperse, that could be an issue. We looked at soil preferences. So we used the USDA Web Soil Survey to understand the general soil preferences, and then we're going to use our soils data to get more detailed information. And we looked at sun and shade preferences because the forest is mostly shade or partial shade, habitat type, and deer impact. For deer impact, we actually don't have deer. We thought there's an opportunity for the forest to be almost an oasis for some of those species that are heavily impacted by deer. So I'm gonna go into a few of our candidate species. So these are the species that we think have some of the best chances to succeed. These are all species on the extirpated list that I'm either currently trying to reintroduce through trial plots, or we're searching for local seed and plants that we could use in our trial plots. The first one is Sanguinaria canadensis, or bloodroot. This is naturally spreading from the edge of the native plant garden into the forest already, which gave us a big hint that it wants to be in the forest. It is spread by a Phenogaster genus ants. So bloodroot has something called an elasmosome. It is like kind of something that's delicious. It's meant to be delicious to ants. Ants then carry those seeds into their nests and they disperse them, and then they'll grow from the nests. And there's a reference population of bloodroot in Van Cortlandt Park. We actually collected some seeds with permission from that population and are growing them right now. And they're a good habitat match for the forest, and they're climate resilient. They're prevalent far into the south. So bloodroot were seen as one of the species that had a really high potential success if reintroduced into the forest. Another species is Solidago flexicolis, or zigzag goldenrod. This is a woodland goldenrod. It's one of only a couple species that really prefers to be in partially shaded areas. This photo actually, I forgot to note, all photos are by Marlon Coe, except for the one specifically noted. He's the photographer for NYBG. So this photo actually was taken by me, and this is a photo of one of those smaller populations that's escaping from the edge of the native plant garden. Importantly, it's escaping into areas that are not irrigated, and it seems to be doing well. There's a Van Cortlandt Park, which again, Van Cortlandt Park is just north of the garden. There's a Van Cortlandt Park reference population for this species. It prefers partial shade, and it's prevalent far into the south. Elymus hystrix, or bottlebrush grass. This is a species that likes dry ridges. I took a picture on a dry ridge at one of my Westchester Land Trust preserves, and we have a lot of dry, partially sunny ridges at the Thain Family Forest. It's present at urban sites, including Van Cortlandt Park and Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx. And again, it's present well into the south. One more species is the wild columbine. This is a species that was tough to find good reference sites because it's so widely planted. One reason, though, that I thought I saw the fact that it's spreading like crazy at the garden as a really good guide that it would do well in the forest. So this is a species that has been planted in gardens at NYBG, and I'm seeing it in tree rings. I'm seeing it in kind of natural areas outside of gardens that are partially sunny. And I'm seeing enough of it that it seems to want to be moving into some of our natural areas. And I think if given a little push, I think it would be able to do very well. It likes woodland habitat with partial sun. And it also, like all the other species mentioned, is climate resilient. It's also one of the most beautiful species on this list. The last species is cinnamon fern. This is a plant that is really abundant in Westchester. I used to see maybe not acres of it in my preserves, but there'd be wetlands that were definitely dominated by it. It's very aggressive in the right situations, and we would be planting this in the floodplain of the Bronx River, which is a tough neighborhood for a plant because we have Japanese knotweed, we have lesser celandine, we have lots of vines. So this is an area where we'd want a more aggressive plant. This is a species that's present in Van Cortlandt Park. And like I said, abundant in Westchester. It's aggressive, and it is, as all of the other species, we considered it climate resilient. So once we know a few of the species that we're interested in, that was a couple of them. There's several more that are being considered, but that was some of the highlights. We need to be able to source these species. So we have two main sources of plants for local ecotype plants and seeds. This is Greenbelt Native Plant Center, which is run by New York City Parks and is a spectacular resource for restoration work. And this other resource is a little bit smaller and less well known. It's a nonprofit started by Linda Roletter, who used to run the Lower Hudson Valley Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, or PRISM, and it's called Wildwoods Restoration Project. So their mission is to work with volunteers to grow native species from local seed to distribute to restoration work. And they, I think, have grown like 20,000 plants in the last few years. So they're really ramping up. So step 3 is once we have a few species that are candidate species chosen, and we've looked at our soil survey data, and we're starting to have an idea what habitat they could do well in. The next step is to test them out in the field. So we've been setting up trial plots. This is a pilot project to evaluate the success of candidate species in the field, and we plant them in a grid pattern. We actually are doing like not a complete grid, but like a diagonal grid where it's, it looks a little bit more natural if you're looking at it from the trail. And the goal is grids of 25 plants. We've found that that's actually kind of challenging due to challenges sourcing specific amounts of native locally sourced plants or growing, specific amounts of local plants. And then there's also a challenge of habitat types. We found that a lot of habitat types these plants like aren't always in a nice 5x5 grid. So we've adapted our grids to match habitat and to match the amount of plants that we've been able to source. And our plan is to evaluate these pilot plots over 2 to 3 years. We want to look at both success of the plants that we plant, and hopefully we want to see some evidence of successful reproduction, either new plants or seeds or flowers as well. And where are we right now? So the first trial plots were actually just installed last week. So this is really just starting to kick off. And we planted Elymus hystrix, Sanguinaria canadensis, and Osmunda cinnamomum. We planted a few species that weren't on the extirpated species list as well, that were species that weren't present in the garden, but we didn't have herbarium vouchers that they were present 100 years ago. But these were the 3 species that we trial plotted that were on our extirpated species list. And step 4 is large-scale reintroduction. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about. And I've read a lot of studies, and there's surprisingly few good examples and case studies of large-scale reintroduction of woodland wildflowers in the Northeast. So if anyone's aware of any good studies, please send them my way. But I think that this is something that has been challenging for a lot of people. There's a few questions that I think are really important for us to understand as we're thinking about larger scale reintroduction. And I think that there's going to be, the science isn't always settled on the answers to these questions. The first question is how many? So how many plants do we need to plant? I think this might be different for different species. And I think it might depend on different conditions. I would like to plant incrementally because, we might have the worst drought that New York City's ever had, like we did last fall. And I think it is best to plan a reintroduction over maybe a 5-year span with a certain amount of plants going in each year. And then designing specifically for each species. I think a lot about bloodroot because bloodroot's distributed by ants. How you would design a project even around the range of ant distribution versus another species that might be distributed by birds. And you could maybe design a little bit differently. Plants or seeds. So a lot of the success that I've seen with woodland restoration, in contrast to prairie restoration, is that plants seem to be more successful versus prairies, where I feel like almost everyone restores prairies with seed. But I think there could be contexts where restoring a forest with seed could work. And then I think we have to think about specific habitats. We have to be very deliberate about which plants are planted where and understand the conditions of different soil types, of where heavy metals and pH are high, or where heavy metals are accumulating, and then also where water is accumulating on the landscape. But first, before we get to this stage, I think this stage is a few years away. I think we really need to understand the success of pilot projects. And I think that we have to have a decent confidence that what we're going to put on the landscape is going to work. I see the entire timeline for this project even in decades. Personally, I think about 20 years, you could really start to see if what you're doing is successful. So I see this as a very doing a project like this is a very long-term effort that you really need to have strong institutional support for if you want to succeed. And then step 5, evaluation. So my trial plots, I'm going to be evaluating just each trial plot, but with the larger project, we're going to be using our CFI plots as that evaluation. So the continuous forest inventory, I'm going to go back to that. That's the series of belt transects that we run across the forests that covers about 15% of the forest area. If these species are genuinely incorporating into the spontaneous flora of the forest, we'll be able to catch that in our transects, and that is the hope and the goal. So the future vision, even longer term than seeing the success of this project, because if we are able to enhance the biodiversity of herbaceous plants in the Thain Family Forest, that's great for the Thain Family Forest, but that's only 50 acres in a much larger landscape. I kind of see this as creating a model that could be brought elsewhere. So we have a lot of urban islands of habitat where I think this model could be really effective. I also think that it could be really effective in areas where we've seen a lot of damage from deer. If you do any hiking in Westchester or Staten Island, you'll see deer impacts across the landscape. There's areas in Westchester where I could walk in the middle of the growing season for hours and not see a single flower because the understory has been decimated. And if those areas, we are going to restore them, we need good models for how that's going to work and how we can be efficient, and because success generates success. If we can be successful and show other people how to succeed, more people are going to try to do it. So this could be a model for how this kind of reintroduction could work across the region. And then also with climate change, we're going to potentially need to be adapting our forests. And I think that's a broader conversation we need to have. But if we do want to enhance the biodiversity of our forests in other ways in the future, we need to know what are the most efficient ways to do that. And lastly, I think it's very important that conservation involves people. I have 2 quotes that I really like. One's from Robin Kimmerer. Give a gift in reciprocity for what you have taken. So she basically, if you're not familiar with Robin Kimmerer, she is a indigenous Potawatomi scholar. She taught at ESF, where I did my master's. She wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and she is really well known for integrating scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and kind of integrating both of those worldviews. And one of her ideas, it's not really her idea, it's more like an indigenous idea that she has been highlighting with her work, is this idea of reciprocity with nature, that we are not actually, we don't need to just take from nature, we can also give back. And then I also have a quote from Aldo Leopold: the best definition of conservation is written not with a pen, but with an axe. So basically, like, you can leave your mark on the landscape. He was working in a landscape of prairie restoration, so that's why the axe was appropriate. In the eastern United States, it's a little less appropriate as a metaphor. So the way that we have been trying to involve people in this work, one, I think it's important that people have an opportunity outside of the practitioner community to be engaged with giving back to the natural world. So we've created a member volunteer program, which we call the Forest Guardians. And it's been opportunities for regular members of the garden to be engaged in this type of work. And then I also think there's a lot of expert knowledge out there that can help guide this work. And wherever possible, I've been trying to reach out to experts who have ideas and thoughts about things, about the details of this project that could impact its success. So I want to leave this on that note, that if you have ideas and thoughts I would love to hear from you. If you have a particular expertise in a particular plant that you think would do well, I would love to hear that. So thank you, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions. If you're on Zoom and you have a question, you can put it in the chat and we'll read it out, or you can unmute and use the raise hand feature or speak to ask a question. Okay, we have a couple questions in the room. Molly, do you want to go ahead?
So the question was, are there any arthropods that you'd like to bring back? And I haven't thought as much about the arthropods. At my previous job, I did do a project restoring white turtlehead to support a population of Baltimore checker spot butterflies. But I have not thought as much about the arthropods at the Thain Family Forest. I think we would need, what I would like to have is more data. There's actually an ongoing inventory of the beetle fauna at the garden right now. I'm very excited to see what the results of that are and what species are missing. And I would love to learn more. We don't have as much data on the pollinators. So I would love to really understand the details of the pollinators at the garden. But I think once you, because to make that call about like what's missing and what you could bring back, you need to know what's there. And also, I don't know if we have it would be a little different because we don't have necessarily the historical record of arthropod diversity the way we do with our flora. But I think you can still make educated assumptions. But I do think it would be interesting to see if there's any holes in our arthropod diversity that could be filled and what impact that would have in the forest. We have a big fence around the whole garden, but also there's not a big population that far into the Bronx yet. Where, uh, there is Van Cortlandt Park, which has deer, and there is sort of corridors between Van Cortlandt Park and the Thain Family Forest, the New York Botanical Garden. There's no really great corridor that deer feel super comfortable on. And I think the deer really haven't like filled in their space in Van Cortlandt Park yet to the point where they want to disperse. The population there is still very small. It'll probably get bigger though. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we can use as a reference population is just farther up on the Bronx River Gorge, and I've done a very regular this fun spring ephemeral walk from Crestwood to Scarsdale for many years now. And so, like there are cinnamon ferns there, and there are sawflies that lay their eggs and mature in the tops of the fronds. So I think, we have seen in the Bronx River Gorge the beetles that pollinate the trout lilies. I don't know if they're in the garden or not.
We have abundant trout lilies. We have like spectacular trout lilies.
I know. I know, but do you have the beetle that pollinates them?
We'll find out very soon. I don't know when the results are going to come out, but I know they're almost done. So it's Rob Noxie, who's the botanist at NYBG. He's doing the beetle survey. But I think with ecology, it's kind of like such a cliche, but everything is so connected, and I think it is important when you do something like this to really think about the big picture, and I think the more information we have about that, the better.
And then I have one other question already from Zoom. I don't remember if this was on your list of variables, but have you looked at slope? Because I know in the Bronx River, like, Dutchman's Breeches, we only find off the main path and up on slopes. So I'm wondering if that's something that you're,
A good example of a species that we're thinking about that has where slope is very important is I think it's Silene caroliniana, the pink, the wild pink. And that's a species where I talked to a few people that told me it really likes on steeper slopes those areas where the leaves kind of like
Yeah.
schleff away. And yeah, so I mean, we're definitely thinking about that. There's certain species that's and the Dutchman's breeches is a species that's on our extirpated list. I think it actually might have been incorrectly put there because we found a population that I think was not planted. But even if we have one population, it's very small. So it's a
Right.
species that we could definitely augment.
Thank you.
All right, a question from the chat. I see a heavy analysis effort on chemical properties of soil, pH, and organic content. Are there any variables in any of the soil horizons on physical and or biological properties?
That's a fantastic question. So that was actually initially one thing we were very interested in. It was too expensive for the amount of grant funding that we had to look into that. The way that we're going about it is, again, we have those 15 ongoing research projects, and we're able to access that data of those external researchers working at NYBG. And there are researchers that are working there right now that are interested in soils. So we're trying to encourage them to look into certain things and share their data with us. For example, we have one grad student who is interested in how the beech leaf disease is affecting the soils. So he's collecting information on fungi and bacterial communities in our beech stands, and that's data that we would like to pull from. So we're trying to get what we can with the funding that we have accessible to us, but it's certainly something that's very important.
All right, again from the chat, Andy says, this is amazing stuff. Are there resources that local people can use to follow in the footsteps of what you're doing in our own bits of forest?
That is a really good question. So we have our Thain Family Forest management program, which the current one is from 2008 to 2025, and that details the work that we're doing and our goals and kind of our management history of the forest. And that can definitely explain, and it's a pretty hefty document. It's like 100 pages, so that it can explain if you're interested in, maybe not managing a backyard so much, but if you're interested in managing landscapes, how we do it. And I think there's a lot of good resources on kind of natural gardening. And if, in your own backyard, trying to restore a little bit more balance, a little bit more ecological integrity, I would personally recommend books by Doug Tallamy as a really good resource. Also, I know that Westchester County has created a website of resources that they're calling Planting Westchester. And then I hope that once we really start to, this project, like I've said, is very early on. Part of the reason I wanted to present on it is because I want people in this world thinking about it and thinking, about their ideas that maybe could be incorporated into it as we're doing the work. But right now we don't have a huge amount of success where I can say this is the exact way you're supposed to do it. Hopefully, give us a few years, we'll be able to develop that.
Hey, I have another soil question. And well, first of all, great project, very challenging. You talked about the heavy metal. Have you had any thoughts? I know you're probably not at this point yet, but just how you're going to strategize the planting based on the possibility of having heavy metals or
What I would do is first, I think a lot more about pH, because pH, there's a lot of species on our extirpated list that are impacted by pH. Blue cohosh is a good example. It's a species I'd really like to bring back. I'm suspicious that our soils have become too acidic for it. But I think heavy metals heavy metals, there's a lot of research they can be damaging to the growth of certain species of plants. So what I'm really interested is seeing if there's any spikes, if there's any areas that are particularly high in heavy metals. My assumption is that like we're looking at reference sites, so the general areas are going to be okay because if you're looking at plants that are growing in Van Cortlandt Park, they're growing in Pelham Bay. If they can, those areas probably don't have two different levels of heavy metal contamination than we do, but what I want to understand is the spatial distribution. If there's certain areas that are really high in heavy metals, I'm not going to be putting my trial plots there. I'm not going to really be planting anything that could be sensitive there because I don't want that to skew my understanding of the success of a planting effort.
Okay, Michael asked, are there any expectations regarding burying beetles? They definitely play an interesting role in soil nutrient cycling.
We actually had a study. I can't speak to it because I read it like 6 months ago. But there is a published study that I believe is publicly available on burying beetles that did work at the New York Botanical Garden. So I'd say if that's something that interests you, I think if you probably Google burying beetles, NYBG, you'd be able to find out some information. But I don't, I can't speak to it too much.
Yeah, and I'm blanking on his name, but there's a researcher at Fordham that has done some work with burying beetles, so he
That
might
might be the one.
So just because you mentioned Doug Talami and somebody had asked about this before, I would also recommend that they look up Homegrown National Park online, which will get them access to a lot of his information. And then my last question, I think, is, do they know why you've got this spotty distribution of heavy metals in some places?
Well, I've just started looking at the data. So we want to understand how heavy metals are distributed, and we want to understand if there are spikes. I'm not saying there are.
Right.
I'm saying that we want to understand how it's distributed across the landscape, if it's variable across the landscape, if water's moving it in certain ways, and if there's areas where we really, if it is variable, we want to be thinking about like how are we going to be interacting with that spatial distribution of the heavy metals as we do our plantings. Perhaps it would allow for some kind of experimental design where some of the plantings are done in heavy metal areas or areas with higher heavy metals. If there is any kind of difference, we're able to see.
Thank you.
And I also just want to add that like NYBG does not have particularly high levels of heavy metal for an urban area. Pretty much every urban forest is impacted by pollution to some extent. I don't want you people to come away from this thinking that we have like, particularly polluted soil. Yeah. It's just a component of the urban landscape.
Thank you so much. I think that was all the questions from Zoom, and it looks like we're good in the room. So I want to end with a question that I ask all of the speakers, which is if there's like one message that you want people to come away with or one thing that you want people to be thinking about as they walk out of the room today, do you want to highlight whatever that may be?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I really like to leave people with kind of what I said on the last slide. I think people often feel that like we are a negative on the world. And the reason I love projects like this is it like we are actively making a natural area more biodiverse. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to kind of have that like reciprocal relationship with nature where we can take for what we need, but also give back to nature. And that's something I encourage people to have hope and also to develop that reciprocal relationship with nature, as I'm sure many of you already are.
Thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause for John. And please visit torreybotanical.org and consider becoming a member. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night.